Half a day, all you HI 101 history students. In this particular video, I'm going to discuss the Chapter 2 questions that deal with England and their American colonies. The first question is identify the economic, religious, and political motivations for the establishment of England's diverse American colonies. The economic settlements were of a few different types. Some of the original colonies were joint stock companies. A joint stock company is a group that sells shares in order to lessen the risk of the individuals involved. The more people they get to invest in this venture, the less risk there is individually, and the more people who invest, it creates large amounts of money that can then be used to try and get the colony rolling. Many of the original colonies, such as Georgia, were private business ventures at the beginning. And eventually they're going to be taken over by the crown and become royal colonies controlled by the king. Mercantilist economics is a big part of the proto-capitalist system. The capitalist system is what we have today. It has its roots in mercantilism, where colonies were viewed as sources of raw materials and as markets for finished goods that are being produced in the mother country. Colonies are also a source for excess populations. Some of the religious motivations are freedom from persecution. The Puritans are very upset at the Church of England and some of its practices with icons and relics. They believe that to be blasphemy, hence the name. They were Puritans. And that is one of the reasons why they left and landed at Plymouth and helped them establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony at the beginning. The colony of Maryland was started by Lord Calvert as a refuge for Catholics in the aftermath of the English Civil War of the mid-17th century. Catholics were heavily persecuted in England as the Protestants regained power under William and Mary. And for that reason, Lord Calvert established that place as somewhere for them to go to be free from such persecution. Some political motivations. Immigration was a way to allow the English to empty their jails. After Captain Cook went to Australia, many of the English that followed in the aftermath of that in the 18th century were convicts. Many of the original British settlers in Australia were convicted criminals. And it was a way of them to empty their jails. Many of those that went to the Americas were a little bit better off. They were more bourgeois. They were more middle class. They could afford to pay for their passage. And they're coming mainly because they believed in the possibility of America offering a better life, which comes to be known as the American dream. The idea that each generation is going to get better than the previous one. That is a core value of the American political system. And these colonists that came to the Americas brought with them the ideas that they have rights as Englishmen, which come out of the Lockean tradition, the ideas of John Locke, that people have certain natural rights. The rights to their life, the right to conduct their lives as they see fit, or to have liberty, and most of all, to have their property protected by that government that is ruling over them. And if these governments then fail to protect these natural rights, it's time for that government to possibly go away. Question 2. Describe the political, economic, social, and religious characteristics of the English colonies in Chesapeake Bay. Again, Maryland was largely a refuge for Catholics. It is a little bit more diverse economy than is in the New England regions. Jamestown originally was a profit-seeking colony. It fails. Eventually, the Virginia Company establishes the headright policy, which promised people coming across the ocean that they would get 50 acres with a purchase of a share in that joint stock company. None of this works very well in terms of attracting enough people in order to labor, and eventually that is solved by slave populations, mainly African Americans. It's not only blacks from Africa that were slaves at the beginning. Native Americans were enslaved as well. But eventually, Africans will fill the main void for slaves. Eventually, Virginia was a royal colony as well. New England, from the beginning, and this is an important thing to remember, is with the adoption of the Mayflower Compact in 1620 on the ships, before they even set foot on the North American continent, that compact said that we will abide by the laws made by leaders that we choose. From the beginning in New England, they have this idea that they will be self-governed. And because of the English tradition of natural rights, there is the idea that what governments can do shall be limited. We talked about Puritans and their need to escape persecution. Rhode Island will develop mainly because it objects to the practices of the Puritans, and from the beginning Roger Williams will champion individual liberty, and he is the guy who helps establish the idea of the separation of church and state. Rhode Island will become a sanctuary for those who believe governments have no right to impose religious beliefs on them. Anne Hutchinson is a famous early American woman. She raised 13 children. And she will come into conflict with the Bay Colony male leadership because she's an intelligent woman who ran what would be called today a salon for intellectual discussion. And eventually she's called before the all-male general court for trying to undermine the kingdom of Christ. Why? Because she doesn't know her place as a proper woman. And she is convicted of blasphemy, and that's when she heads out and goes to Rhode Island for a time. Eventually she's going to die in New York. She'll be killed by Indians. Out of New England will come what are today the states of Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine. Originally that was all Massachusetts. The Carolinas will be split into North and South. Charlestown or Charleston will be a big city in South Carolina. South Carolina will mainly be concerned with plantations, growing those items, rice, indigo, which is an important crop that is used in seafaring vessels. It can be used to create dyes that are used to help preserve things or to waterproof vessels. You can make tar out of that, and that will be coated on the bottom of ships, helping to waterproof them. Big part of the South Carolina economy, as was rice before the 19th century cotton kingdom takes over everything. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania. William Penn, this was a proprietorship. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was run by William Penn, who was a Quaker. The Friends, who treat everyone as equals. This is another anomaly in the original 13 colonies. The Friends will have no difficulty in getting along with Native American groups because they honored their treaties, because they believe in this egalitarian idea of human beings. Georgia is the last colony to be established. It was established for the worthy poor. Again, many convicts also traveled to this colony, and it's also viewed by the English as a buffer against the Spanish South, Spanish Florida. It doesn't work out very well, and by 1754, this is also a royal colony. Analyze the ways in which the English colonists and Native Americans adapted to each other's presence. We've already talked about some of this in Chapter 1. There were the Columbian or agricultural exchanges. There's many, many battles over the lands. And eventually, the Europeans are going to take the Native American lands. The Algonquins were along the English seaboard. The Powhatan Confederacy in the Virginia region will be Bacon's Rebellion. You can read about that in the text. Governor Berkeley will not come to the aid of what will become the state of West Virginia someday. It has its roots in this conflict. The Western Virginians were not helped by those in the eastern part of Virginia, by the Tidewater plantation people. They did not help them in their struggles against Native Americans. And eventually there will be a rebellion that sees Berkeley taken prisoner, and many of those in power were killed by the rebels. Eventually Berkeley comes back to power and he hanged all the rebels. The rebellion died out after Nathaniel Bacon died. The Pequots, in the aftermath of the 1637 war, were destroyed. King Philip's War, his Native American name is Metacomet. This was another bloody war between Puritans and the Wampanoags. This war killed more people and caused more destruction in New England in proportion than any American conflict since. Those that were captured were sold to the Europeans for goods, firearms, and rums. This was so profitable that the Georgians and the South Carolinians noticed it, and they began to get involved in the slave trade at that time. The Iroquois got along quite well with the French while they were in power in the North American continent. They vastly outnumber the Europeans, and the Iroquois will eventually make alliances with the English to help defeat their rivals like the Algonquins and the Hurons that are farther west in places in what are today Michigan, Wisconsin, and some of the lower Great Lakes states just below the lakes, Ohio, Indiana, and in those regions. The Ohio Valley is a very strategic place in the 18th century. Slavery will become more common in the Carolinas because of the type of economy. The plantation economy will come to dominate there, and the slave trade will become a very important part of existence in those colonies. The Middle Passage is the middle leg of the triangular trade that exists. Those page numbers are from the old textbook. Don't worry about that. It is talked about. Guns and rum and other raw materials will be brought to the African continent in exchange for slaves, which are then brought back across into the Caribbean, where they are offloaded and sold, and then raw materials like molasses and sugarcane are then loaded onto the vessels and taken back into New England, where they are distilled for more rum, and possibly guns are manufactured in New England and loaded onto the ship to go back across the Atlantic to be sold to the Africans for more slaves that are then loaded onto the ships back to the Caribbean. That is one triangular trade route that was established. There was slave resistance during different times in American history. There was a great deal of exchange as a result of these cultures coming in contact with one another. Eventually, African Americans come to dominate much of the foodstuffs, the music that is played in America, and other cultural traditions that have their roots in African American slavery. Jazz music has its roots in gospel and in many of the old songs that were sung by slaves. The last question explained how the English colonies became the most populous, prosperous, and powerful region in North America by 1700. And again, it has to do with the ideas of self-government. These are very motivated people. They want to succeed, and they also have widespread private property or land ownership. And because of the English tradition of natural rights, governments then are required to protect these natural rights. That's it for this chapter.